This lesson focuses on your core, your lower back, and your hip flexors. Your core is the area around your midsection. In other words, your abdominals and your sides on the side of your abdominals. Obviously, your lower back, which is opposite of your abdominals, and then your hip flexors, which is the area where the top of your legs connect to your stomach. The reason I'm talking about all of those areas together, the core, the lower back, and the hip flexors, is because when we work out our midsection, we need to have balance. And that's why I have the scale here. Because whatever you do to one side, you need to do evenly to the other side. And that's what we're going to be talking about now. So here we have our abdominals, our obliques on the side, and our lower back opposite of the abdominals. And down here we have our hip flexors, the areas that connect our legs to our stomach area. We need to stay balanced when working out because if we develop one side more than the other side, the side that is less developed, the side that is less strong will have the problem. So for example, if we work out our abdominals all the time, but never work out our lower back the same amount, these muscles will get weaker in comparison to these muscles, and eventually we're going to pull our lower back. If you were to work one side of your obliques more than the other, then what would happen is this side would develop better, this side would be weaker, and eventually when moving, you would pull or tear the weak side. That's why we need to stay balanced between the front and the back, the side and the side, and then as well as the hip flexors in comparison to everything else. So for as much time as we spend doing crunches, we also need to spend time working on our lower back by doing a trunk lift to stay balanced. Not only does this balance help us avoid injury, but it helps us from looking silly. No one wants to have this look. And as you can see, the balance I'm talking about isn't only between your abdominals and your lower back or your obliques on one side and the other. It's also the other muscles. For example, your pectoralis compared to your latissimus dorsi. If one is weak while the other is strong, the weak one's going to get hurt. The most common tear or pull that we hear about is in the legs. There's muscles on the front part of the legs and the back part of the legs. The front part of the legs have the quadriceps, and the back part of the legs have the hamstrings. And the most common injury that happens because of a weakness between one side or another is actually when an athlete like a football player or a sprinter, basketball player, when they get up and run as fast as they can, or when they're already running and then they explode to run even faster, they pull their hamstring. Everybody's always heard about someone pulling their hamstring or pulling their hammy. Well, what happens is the quadricep is strong, but while they've been training, they haven't been training their hamstrings as much, and what ends up happening is they pull or tear their hamstrings because their hamstrings are not strong enough to stay balanced to the strength of the quadriceps, therefore pulling and ripping the muscle on the weak side. So let's avoid injury by staying balanced. Let's get back to our abdominals and our obliques. I'm sure that most everyone knows that when you do a crunch, you're working your abdominals. A crunch is also the best way to isolate your abdominals. You're not working your hip flexors or your obliques at all when you're doing a basic crunch. This is another way to do a crunch. Sometimes people like having their legs up, or like in the last image, some people like having their legs down. But more importantly here is notice her fingers. Her fingers are not wrapped behind her head. She's not pulling out her neck to do a crunch. What she's doing is she's purposely putting her fingers on the side of her head just so that she doesn't pull up on her neck. Sometimes people try to avoid pulling on their neck by just leaving their hands across their chest, almost like they're Dracula coming out of a coffin. But here's another way to do a crunch without pulling on your neck. And here's the final way to do essentially a crunch, except we call this a curl up. So instead of putting your hands along the side of your head or folding them across your body, when we just saw the last images of a crunch, We actually call this a curl up, though it's very similar. The only difference is your arms are along the side of your body, and what we're trying to do is slide our hands 4.5 inches, and you guys are used to doing this because we do this every year for the fitness test. And it doesn't matter if we are flexing our bicep or we're flexing our abdominals. Either way, this is still called a curl. This is a bicep curl, and this is an abdominal curl. Both of them are curls. And then finally we have a sit-up, which is the longest range of motion. Range of motion means how far it goes. So with a crunch, we barely move up. With a curl-up, we move up a little bit further, and then with a sit-up, we actually sit all the way up, so it's got the longest range of motion. But no matter which one of them you're doing, a crunch, a curl-up, or a sit-up, we're still working our abdominals. When we're doing more of a range of motion, in other words, coming further up on our motion on our curl-up, crunch, or in this case, a sit-up, sometimes it's harder for people because their stomachs aren't strong enough to get them all the way up. That's when people hold their feet down or when they hook their feet under something. When this happens, it becomes less of an abdominal movement and a little bit more of a hip flexor movement. And your hip flexors are actually the first thing that pull you up, and your abdominals just support the movement. Sometimes we don't have people hold your feet, but we actually hook our feet into something that holds our feet down. And again, our hip flexors are the first thing that help our movement come up in our range of motion, and then our abdominals just support that movement. So when your feet are hooked or someone's holding your feet, it ends up being a little bit more of a hip flexor movement first, and abdominals are the secondary muscle that are supporting it. That's it for this part of the lesson. Next time we'll talk about how we get our obliques involved by twisting, and we'll also involve our lower back with various extensions and trunk lifts and things like that. So anyways, turn your cameras on, and I will excuse you once I see everybody with their cameras on.